While the international news media have trained their lenses on the war in Syria, there's another conflict in Yemen that fails to get its share of coverage. Ever since March of last year, when Saudi Arabia and its allies intervened to restore President Abd Mansur Hadi to power after he was deposed by rebel Houthis, both sides in this conflict have stocked up on all the media weaponry available to fight the propaganda war. Rebel forces took over Yemeni state media to tell the story of heroic Houthi revolutionaries offering national redemption. That was countered with a mirror TV channel set up offshore in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, beaming in the story of an internationally recognized government trying to regain power. Those media narratives have been bolstered regionally, with Saudi Arabia's own TV networks and other media outlets in the Gulf pushing the kingdom's narrative, and pro-Houthi outlets beaming out of Iran and Lebanon. Advantage? Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have more money and media platforms at their disposal, and they've also invested in a major PR campaign to push their own narrative overseas. But with the war there now into its second year, at least 6,000 people killed, and an unfolding humanitarian crisis, that's a tough story to put a positive spin on. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on Yemen, the war, and the way the story's being reported.
This is Yemen TV. This is also Yemen TV. Two media outlets with the same name, both profess to be the channel of all Yemenis. They're reporting on the same war, to the same local audience, from totally opposite angles. One is the main state-owned channel under the control of the Houthis, the rebel group that took power in 2014.
وأطفال اليمن الذين يعانون يوميا من القتل والدمار والهلع الذي يرتكبه العدوان السعودي الأمريكي.
The other was launched in 2015 out of the Saudi capital of Riyadh, a move to back exiled President Abd Mansur al-Hadi on the airwaves, as Saudis led a military intervention to reinstate him on the ground.
استشهد مدني في قصف مدفعي عشوائي شنته الميليشيا الانقلابية على أحياء سكنية بمدينة تعز.
It was like a boxing match in the media. The Houthis were trying to obviously seize this kind of power over the domestic audience about events that were going on, trying to obviously make the Saudis out as the main enemy.
حيث تتواصل انتصارات الجيش واللجان الشعبية ضد قوى الغزاة والمرتزقة في مختلف جبهات القتال.
Whereas from Riyadh's perspective, the Houthis were the enemy, and they were, if anything, invaders into Sana'a.
يذيق رجال المقاومة والجيش الوطني أفراد الميليشيا الويلات. تعود عصابات التمرد لقصف المدينة.
From the Saudi side and the Yemeni government side, this war is all about bringing back the legitimate government, which is President Hadi and the government he has in Riyadh. And they continuously keep repeating this narrative in all the papers. This is all about bringing back stability, bring back peace into Yemen. Obviously, that's not what's happening, because instead of bringing back peace, they're blowing the country into pieces. And on the other side, the Houthis, they're really playing into this whole, we're the national force on the ground that's fighting this foreign intervention that's coming in from the air.
The Houthis' own strategy has been quite limited because they lack platforms, they lack funds, they lack access, they lack experience in this field. You're looking at a group that represents anywhere between 10% and the exaggerated version, a third of the country, that had very little access to government institutions, and overnight they needed to present a very coherent media narrative. Of course, they have failed to do so.
But this is a conflict that goes beyond Yemen, that's shaken the Middle East and aggravated regional rivalries, a conflict being fought on a media battlefield throughout the region. On one side, there are channels broadcasting out of GCC countries. On the other, Iran's Arabic language channel and two outlets from Lebanon.
When you watch, for example, Al Jazeera Arabic, or if you watch Al Arabiya.
ضراوة المعارك التي دارت هنا تسببت بكل هذا الدمار علاوة على همجية وعبثية الميليشيات الانقلابية.
They will support the stories that support their narrative and that they want heard by the world, like the atrocities that are being committed by the Houthis, and very little attention is being put by the extreme humanitarian catastrophe and loss by Saudi airstrikes.
You have the counter-narrative coming from pro-Houthi news stations and media organizations in the Middle East. Al-Manar, the voice of Hezbollah.
أما الجهد السعودي لإشعال المنطقة وأزماتها فيقاس بما تكشفه الأيام من تنسيق عال بين الرياض وتل أبيب.
Al-Mayadeen, which is also based in Lebanon, and Al-Alam, which is an Iranian TV station and media network.
واصل تحالف العدوان السعودي ومرتزقته خرق اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار باستهداف المدنيين وممتلكاتهم في اليمن.
More or less, the three stations are championing the cause of the Houthis, with very little attempt at disguising that. We are talking about sheer propaganda through and through.
In the pro-Iranian media coverage, you never get the sense that the Houthis have been driving this conflict from the beginning and that they've pushed the conflict at every stage.
ميدانيا استشهد 7 أطفال وامرأة فيما جرح 12 بينهم 6 أطفال في غارات لطائرات التحالف.
You get the impression that this is some sort of capricious wild action by irresponsible and perhaps even bloodthirsty Gulf troops that are just randomly killing people left, right and center for no reason. And I think there's been a great deal of focus on civilian deaths and suffering, as I say, as if it were all caused by the coalition. So I think their coverage has been wildly biased and intended to cast the coalition's intervention in the worst possible light.
Hussein Ibish is with a think tank funded by different Gulf states. This year it's Abu Dhabi. Last year it was Saudi Arabia. According to the Institute's tax filing in 2014, part of its mission is to, quote, engage with the local, regional and international print and broadcast media, as well as blogs and other social media on issues of importance to the US and the Arab Gulf states. Saudi Arabia has spent millions of dollars hiring PR firms to target journalists and policymakers. Take Washington-based Corvus, whose clients also include Bahrain. They're on a $240,000 a month retainer to push the Saudi line through press releases, briefings and online sites like this one. And Arabia Now, a media portal which reiterates Riyadh's commitment to providing humanitarian aid for civilians affected by the war. Add to that the TV appearances and op-eds by key political figures in the international media.
I think the Saudis became much more aware of the importance of pushing their sort of media campaign in America, particularly once reporting became more critical of them. The Saudis realized then that they did have a PR issue, basically, and they have. You know, they've spent millions of dollars on hiring the best PR firms and trying to put their voice out.
You'll see articles that make very strong arguments against the war, and a few days later you'll see someone counter that argument. For example, in the Telegraph, it was the Saudi ambassador. In the New York Times, President Hadi wrote an op-ed. You had the Saudi ambassador to the United States respond to articles on the Wall Street Journal.
I don't think the Houthis will probably be having the same budget to be spending on trying to get any of the Houthi representatives writing to the New York Times anytime soon.
So what the Saudis have tried to do is to say, look, you know, first there's another side here. There's the Houthis, and to emphasize the idea that they represent Iranian influence, Iranian encroachment, and that the coalition simply had no choice but to fight back against that. And secondly, that they are defending an internationally legitimate government, that is the Hadi government.
It's important to note that Saudi media power and influence goes back all the way to the Gulf War, 1990 and 91, where the Saudis began realizing the need to control and influence, or buy influence, in as much Middle Eastern media and international media as possible. They have an already existing media infrastructure that allowed them to immediately, the moment they want to buy influence regarding any particular issue in the Middle East, the infrastructure is there. The media platforms are available.
Media platforms buy influence. They can determine public support. That's why the Houthis took over Yemen TV. That's why the Saudis are beaming in a counter-narrative from Riyadh. It's why a propaganda war is being waged across the region in a conflict that goes way beyond Yemen's borders. Caught in the crossfire and the confusion are the Yemeni people, 27 million of them, in a war most had no interest in waging, a story they have no role in telling.